everyone. Welcome back to the recording room. Today we are very happy to have Mr. James Ehrlich, resident entrepreneur and lecturer at Stanford University, with us today on the show. Today, the main topic will be about REGEN Villages, the company sustainable living that Mr. Ehrlich is founding and directing. So welcome, Mr. Ehrlich.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Yeah. Now, before we get into the topic of REGEN Villages, I know you have a very interesting background. So, for instance, I heard you were designing video games in Silicon Valley before going into sustainable living. So could you explain how did your paradigm shift from video games to environment?
Yeah. So I grew up, to get the context, flow kind of correct there. I grew up actually in New York and did my undergrad at New York University. And it was a mix of computer science and media. So there was already an interest I had from a young age in the early Atari arcade games and video games. And when those platforms started to come to cartridge games in homes, I started to get really excited about that industry and about how I could get involved in that. So after my undergrad, I moved to Northern California and started doing some work doing game design, contract, for Sega, Nintendo, Atari, and then started my own company in the early 1990s, doing both game design, but also doing tools for special effects for motion pictures and doing some interesting work with like George Lucas and those folks. And really what happened was, because I had moved to almost, I'd say, the countryside, north of the Golden Gate Bridge. So it was north of Silicon Valley by, maybe half an hour or so from the Golden Gate, from San Francisco proper. But this part of what's called Western Marin is you're just kind of bridging next to horse and cattle and small plot family farm country. So I just started becoming friends with these small plot family farmers who were growing these very beautiful, very delicious artisanal ingredients, and I got just really excited about this whole idea of symbiosis in nature. So that the kind of farming they were doing was called biodynamic, and which goes several steps beyond organic. So it has a lot to do with the work of Rudolf Steiner from the early 1900s, and also these folks were either they were living in the Bucky Fuller domes, or they were being involved in these sort of Bucky Fuller type communities, and so I was kind of bombarded early on in this by both of the farm to table communities and the sort of resiliency in the built environment, where these people were cobbling together the state of the art back then in passive home typologies and low board geothermal and biomass, biogas, and they were experimenting with early photovoltaic panels and all these different pieces coming together that they were making work. These systems didn't talk to each other, but they worked individually, cobbled together, and what that meant was that these were communities, neighborhoods that were capable of generating their own power in case of some kind of power outage. They were capable of generating and harvesting clean water and digesting their waste into resources, and also they were able to generate a pretty significant amount of food and nutritional input in a very small footprint, around their homes. So I was impacted by that. That's what really struck me. It was these incredible farm to table meals, sitting with people, just feeling healthy, feeling happy, great laughter, great conversations. And so I started to do this case study research about the work of Rudolf Steiner and Buckminster Fuller and these other lovely folks from Australia, Bill Mollison on permaculture. And as I was started to film the interviews with these farmers and track where the food was going, that actually turned into a popular television cooking show, TV show that I produced and directed. Originally it was called Organic Living. We had a sister TV show called Hippy Gourmet, kind of edgy. And it really just was a labor of love. It was just something doing on the side of my software company. But eventually that took hold and became a very popular TV series. We reached about 35 million homes a week on national public television and had a best-selling companion cookbook that I co-authored on Hachette. But the stories in the book itself and the show itself was also about these, in-between stories of resiliency in the built environment. And so when I came to Stanford in 2012, I had already, roughly 15 years experience, in this area of case study research of organic, biodynamic, and self-sustaining neighborhoods. And so I joined the solar decathlon competition at Stanford, and that really was a really interesting competition, sponsored initially by the U.S. Department of Energy, who could build the most energy positive home. And the competition was basically you design and flat pack a home, you send it to some location around the world, designated location where the competition is going to be held. The house gets built, and then there's these judges, and they judge the 20 homes. But part of the competition also is that the house, when it's finished, has to be deconstructed, sent back to each campus where it came from, built up again, and then actually become a real house. So it wasn't a Hollywood set. It had to be a very real house, a really very real structure. But when I came into this research, the first thing I said to the professors was, it occurs to me that a smart house inside of a dumb neighborhood doesn't make much sense. And I was really blessed to be involved, with professors, from the Center for Design Research and School of Mechanical Engineering at Stanford. And they all just sort of leaned in and they said, okay, we love this idea, this thought process that you're going in. So we think you should make this, kind of your thesis, your research initiative. So part of it, of course, was being done, through the solar decathlon, through the built environment. But there was another part of it that I had an interest in that I self-funded and I did off campus because I'm an entrepreneur, right? So I understood the rules, regulations, the permutations in dealing with licensing and tech, especially dealing with universities. And so I self-funded some research off campus. And we started really looking carefully at sort of coding and a software platform that could model a natural symbiosis and be able to actually then interface with and integrate these previously siloed components that I mentioned before and create a modern eco-village interpretation that could be designed by software and then managed by software. So that's the long story of me growing up in New York, moving out to California, having software company, going into research, and then bringing that research forward through Stanford. And in 2016, we founded a Dutch holding company, so a for-profit impact company focusing on asset-backed land development, but married with software and tech. Okay, so come a bit before the Ecovillages, I want to talk about a bit more about the cooking show, because I think in a recent interview you said that food allowed people to overcome their barriers, such as socioeconomic or their cultural barriers. So can you explain how your experience with food during your cooking show, which reached, I think, 35 million viewers, as you said, how did that impact your later vision with REGEN Villages and your actions with it? Well, I was like I said, I was really lucky to grow up in New York City and be blessed to be surrounded by, just about every culture on earth in terms of cuisine, right? So it's a really thankful place to be, especially if you have some money and resources. You can have pretty much whatever food you want delivered. Yes. At 3 a.m. So that it's that kind of city. But specifically, the farm to table power and impact on me was something I was really trying to understand better and better, because what I felt was that there was something more going on than just the fact that the food was fresh, right from, harvested right in front of us. And so to me, there's this whole idea about bioavailability of nutrition. In other words, that, when you harvest something and you put it on the back of a truck, and then it goes through a warehouse, and then it goes to packaging, and it goes to retail. And, by the time you eat that tomato, it doesn't taste like a tomato anymore or smell like a tomato anymore. It's gone through so much kilometers and processing that it's lost its vibrance. And I think, to a certain extent, some of its nutritional value or bioavailability at least. So I was really curious about that. But then, moreover, what I really felt was that these communities and these farm to table experiences were that it didn't matter if you didn't speak the same language as people. When you harvested something and you brought something to the kitchen and you were, together and you were chopping things and you were, putting things into a pot and stirring things up and the spices and the ingredients were going in, that you were imparting these stories of their ancestors, these stories of their culture, of their upbringing. And so when you it's all visceral, of course, right? You're smelling it, you're tasting it, you're feeling it. And so, like I said, even if you didn't speak the same language, you could taste something and smile and laugh and engage and speak the language, or the grand translator was actually food in that way. I've also experienced in my travels around the world these really beautiful eco-village communities, collaboratives, co-housing, intentional agri-hoods, if you will, where there's a lot of different people that are diverse, different socioeconomic level, cultural, ethnic, race, religions. But at the long farm table meal, everybody just felt the same, equal, and enjoying each other's company. Kids were running around, seniors were doing what they're doing, being with the kids and others. The village mentality is vibrant and powerful, and it sort of buzzes with the sense of belonging, which is something we have completely dissociated ourselves from as a species, right? Living in big cities, separate from our nature, separate from each other. This idea of like assisted living and senior living, etc., that's really basically purgatory. So what it does is it communicates to youth like yourself and people younger that when you get to a certain age, you're no longer needed. You're no longer wanted. You get pushed out, right? And the truth is that the best cultures, the best communities are based on this diversity of age. So babies and kids and teenagers and young adults and couples and retirees and even people, then getting into hospice care and passing away in the community, right? That you live in this story arc of life where you always feel at home and you're always welcome. So that's where the food ties it all together from our perspective. And it's also similar to this blue zone research, which parallels my research around the world, where people are living to like 110 years old based on what they're eating and living in these communities.
Okay, so you think that food is really appealing to you like a fundamental nature of the human being, something that ties everyone together.
Right, exactly.
Okay. So in one of your previous interviews, you used the term compassionism to describe your philosophy. So do you think your actions with food and how REGEN Villages produce food is embodying this your philosophy of compassionism?
Yeah, so what's interesting is that the body of our Stanford research sort of started in, like I mentioned, in the School of Mechanical Engineering and the Center for Design Research at Stanford on the resiliency in the built environment. So it shows the nuts and bolts to like build this kind of community, putting these pieces together infrastructure-wise. But then I transitioned and I went over to the School of Medicine at Stanford, and initially was at the Center for Compassion, Altruism, Research, and Education under Dr. James Doty, and was there for about a year and a half, progressing this idea that how you live and where you live, can improve healthy outcomes, right? And that there can be and must be a kind of additional part of a spreadsheet that focuses on compassion, altruism, and empathy in design thinking, right? That when you do that, there are proven healthy outcome results that can happen from that. So that's where and I had my experiences, with Dr. Doty even before I came to Stanford, because we had become friends and had done some work together previously when I was designing some video games around this interesting topic of compassion, altruism, and empathy for triggering pro-social behaviors, and oxytocin release and other kinds of things. So it's always been interesting and important for me to have that as part of my influence, especially when you're looking at like indigenous First Nations wisdom and wanting to design communities around natural resource flows, that you want to include those voices and the cultural aspects of those places. That requires empathy. That requires compassion. That requires thinking differently than traditional real estate development or software development. And then basically in 2019 and to now, I moved over to the Stanford Flourishing project, which is also in the School of Medicine, but it's under the Health and Human Performance umbrella. And under Dr. Neil Chima, Stanford Flourishing project is really focusing on what are the circumstances for creating flourishing, both human, species, planetary, environmental, etc. Where REGEN Villages research is germane to the Maslow hierarchical needs.
Yeah.
That if you have dignified housing that's energy positive, and clean water, clean food, clean waste to resource management, hygiene, and you're answering for those basic human needs, then you open up the opportunity space for what it means to flourish and to feel like you're surrounded by abundant surplus. So these are very material kinds of research initiatives that can be connected with whether it's functional MRI or just even statistical burden reduction, on healthcare systems. That there's good science behind this. In other words, of how you can actually create and improve, flourishing, and that's where there's this wonderful connection now between this bed of research and this understanding and regenerative, resilient infrastructure and permaculture design thinking. So it's not squishy science, in other words. It's really, really pretty well rooted in, when you improve an ecosystem, these are the, these are the benefactors of that. Exactly.
Okay, perfect. Understood. Then let's move on to the topic of improving the environment and eco-villages. So first of all, so some very basic question for like all our listeners is, as a founder, what was your vision for REGEN Villages? What was the main motivator for you to pursue this project?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I had thought that, mistakenly so, that we had this under control, meaning planetary boundaries and being able to see from my personal experiences these eco-villages, intentional communities, organic biodynamic farms. Just during the process of producing our TV show, the word organic literally market tested initially in the year 2000 as manure and compost, if you can imagine. And just a few years later, we like to think we were part of that kind of positive messaging, but about 2004 or so, 2005, the word organic had completely transitioned to meaning clean and green and worth 40% more at the supermarket.
Yes.
Right? And that's a sea change in just 4 years. Right. So we thought, well, okay, things are going in the right direction. Of course, you're in a bubble because you surround yourself with these like-minded people, which is what we had done. But what was the epiphany for me was that my son was born in 2010, and that was right at the moment that the BP oil disaster happened in the Gulf of Mexico, and that was, pretty disastrous, catastrophic. From our menu perspective, I used to love to buy all kinds of seafood from this part of the world, from this ecosystem. And so, we realized, we can't do that now for some period of time, and I don't know when that is going to feel comfortable again for that to be the case. And then on the heels of that, in 2011, Fukushima happened. And of course, there was, tremendous, fear and anxiety over the release and what that was going to mean, both, airborne isotopes and seaborne, isotopes, et cetera. And when you're looking in the eyes of a young child who's a year and a half, 2 years old, all of a sudden the gravity on your shoulders becomes untenable. You just have to do something, isn't it? So, and I thought to myself, gosh, I'm accepted this role at Stanford. I come in, I have, this background both in software and tech and being an entrepreneur, and now this case study research on how these communities can get, how we can live in safety within natural boundaries, and at the neighborhood scale, not city scale, right? Not to say that we can't do retrofits for cities, but that to start with, to look at the near suburban, peri-urban, especially the sprawl that's happening and creating new suburbs, that we could create a new suburban model that is what's called an agrihood, right? And have these systems working very effectively. So, in other words, what I wanted to do was not just put my head in the sand and pretend like the world is fine and we'll just get through it and whatever. I wanted to devote my life and on a mission for not just my son, but for other people's kids and the future of our planet, for your future, for your kids' future, for whoever's listening, future, that one person or several group of people coming together can make a huge impact and a huge difference. So that's when I really came up with this idea for REGEN Villages, inspired by the decathlon competition and this one question that I asked the professors about the smart house inside of a dumb neighborhood. And so right then and there, it was born, because these professors at Stanford gave me design empathy. They looked in my eyes and they said, we believe in you, we believe in this idea. We believe that this is a good idea, a great idea. And moreover, we believe that once you start to do the math on it, that it probably does make sense to make some kind eventually of a spin-off company from this and see how it could be elevated to reach a point of to transact with the big funds, and thereby being, this lovely, again, circularity back to research grants and other kinds of gifts to universities, so that we are paying it forward for what's happening from us. So that's how it all kind of got born from that.
Yeah. Okay. So your system with the REGEN Villages, sort of like the villages themselves, are a circular system of feeding back upon its own resources.
Exactly. It's what the world has to understand. We live in a world of silos. Because you're in a university campus, that it's wonderful, it's incredible, but even across an engineering quad, the right hand doesn't even know that a left hand exists, let alone that they're working on maybe similar or complementary things. So Stanford a few years ago created a program called Catalyst, which is really fantastic because it enables groups of masters, PhD candidates, postdocs, whatever it is, to come together, professors to come together and do these projects that are cross-quad, right? And of course, that if you're doing an engineering project, that computer science would be engaged, that Stanford Earth would be engaged, that the business school could be engaged. In other words, it's there's no reason why there shouldn't be this full stack approach. So, and in many ways, REGEN Villages represents that catalyst. It represents that full stack approach, not only for breaking university silos, but most of all, industrial silos. For instance, there's no reason why water pumps shouldn't be able to communicate with the microgrid powering them, and where they understand each other's relationship to each other.
Yeah.
So that's really the idea behind the integration and the circularity back to campuses.
Okay, then talking about breaking silos, I think this moves us to the topic of Village OS, which is the OS that REGEN Villages is based on, and which also sort of use artificial intelligence, if I understood it correctly, to learn from its environment and share it with other villages around the world. So can you explain a bit about Village OS? Why is it important? And I will come back a bit later to the topic of barriers and they're breaking down with Village OS.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, basically, when I started the research initiative, both on campus and off campus, at Stanford, roughly 2012, 13, the companies that we were talking to, these big companies with power, water, waste, food, these kinds of things, infrastructure, whatever, they had systems, but the systems did not have open APIs, application program interfaces. They were talking about building them, but they weren't there yet. But I already had in my mind having a substrate of a Village OS that could be agnostic and could accept the information coming in and going out to these systems in a way that these companies would find incredibly rewarding and beneficial, because they could not only learn from the data across those systems, but they could also see how there's a business model in these turnkey neighborhoods, turnkey communities, with all of these facilities being connected to each other. So in other words, that they become like a favored vendor in a way, because they're there early and participating. So that's where we started this concept of the data model, for architecting the data model. But we really didn't start coding until about 2017, and that was because I'd come from a software background, right? I come from developing software, and so people have said to me before that I am sort of my skill set really is connecting the dots and taking previously non-integrated systems and integrating them, and where there is a new business model from that, right? So we waited till 2017 until those big companies, matured their APIs. There was no reason to start to code and create something that you would have to force them to try to buy into. Instead, you wait for them to do their APIs. We gain a certain amount of understanding and position on that, and then we started coding in earnest in 2017. And then since then we've created a model that's incredibly elegant and agnostic, and is capable of looking at the complexity of neighborhood infrastructure: food, water, energy, waste to resource management, passive home, smart home, if you will, connectivity, external services to mobility, to a curriculum, healthcare, a lot of things happening, in just huge troves of data on a daily basis, where we also understood that machine learning has been and continues to mature to such a point where we could then sort of task out these data points to learn and improve, optimize, and or mitigate, right? And And moreover, to then allow us the ability, not just in monitoring things and having dashboards, not to say that that's bad, but you want to move past that, where we could actually get to the point of actuating and controlling for these things happening in a community. And then beyond that, from a Bucky Fuller perspective, or now contemporarily Elon Musk, that Tesla, that these neighborhoods could communicate with each other across the cloud and learn and improve based on where they are in climate zones. So border-free data that is related to climate urgency, and I think the most beautiful thing to say about the Village OS is that it is evolving. It is intended to continue to evolve and improve and mitigate. So it's never done. I mean, that's a really exciting opportunity, especially because we understand that every day there's going to be new modules, new technologies, whether it's power, water, waste, food, new kinds of farming, robotics. We have a software stack now that's completely capable of welcoming those systems in and including them into that data mix. So that's the overarching concept behind the Village OS software.
Okay, so the Village OS software is capable of taking in new technologies, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, I mean that's the idea. It's a constant optimization, simulation, result-driven software stack,
okay.
Which means that you can introduce new systems virtually, right? Yeah. You don't have to actually physically implement them. You can virtually drop them in to like a Sim City environment, and that's really the basis of our software. That it's generative, and that the use of the software is to change the bloody zoning and planning rules. Okay, number one, because right now it's not a matter of science, technology, or physics to build these neighborhoods quickly. Right?
Yeah.
That really what it comes down to, it's a matter of policy and money. And when all the stars are aligned, and we've seen this happen around the world, when all the stars are aligned, these kinds of new build communities can go up really quickly. Like within, 2 years or so, you could see a 400 or 500 home community go up and be finished within 3 years, 2 to 3 years, something like that. Finished move-in, done. Now, for a lot of planners and governments around the world, that's like bending time-space continuums, because they see things through the lens of decades. It takes a decade to get community approval. It takes a decade to get planning conditions or zoning conditions changed. And meanwhile, there's an urgent housing crisis on Earth, 1 billion or more shortage of houses. And we can't keep building the same kind of subdivisions. We know that already, that are paving over farmland.
Coming to the question of governmental legal system and the governmental system in general, such as the zoning laws. So I think in a previous interview, you said those zoning laws are often established centuries earlier by mostly white men. And then, so how do you see your Village OS overcoming them? So I know you just talk about those zoning laws being a barrier to us revamping the model of subdivisions. So how do you see your Village OS overcoming those barriers?
Well, look, before there was an Uber and a Lyft, okay, you had to call a taxi or rent a car.
Yes.
Or buy a car or take a bus or a train or whatever it is. There was no software resource-driven, kind of application to reinvent that. And there were all of these hurdles that Uber and Lyft had to get through and still get through in terms of the folks who drive taxis and who have to spend a lot of money getting a medallion that proves that they are licensed and safe and all that stuff. A cabbie in London, for instance, has to study for, I think, 2 or 3 years, has to know all of the roads by heart in London to be able to get a cab license. And then all of a sudden, some person with a Prius comes along, and gets this ability to eat this person's lunch. So what happened? How were they able to do that? Airbnb in a very similar way. Before, when you needed to go to stay in a city, you really only had a couple of choices. Either you knew somebody there that you could crash on their couch or in their spare room, or you had to get a hotel. You know what I mean? Now, or a hostel. There was no resource-driven app for that. So what does it take for a software stack to be able to leapfrog and create a new overlay of rules and regulations that makes the old rules kind of obsolete in a lot of ways? So there are driving forces now behind this. One is the fact that there's a host of generative software products coming from big companies like Alphabet. They have a product from Sidewalk Labs called Delve. This is, machine learning to design cities. Like, here's a city block. Here's the GIS data on that block, and then here are 10,000 permutations of buildings that the software just can throw out, right? And then it allows the stakeholders, the developer, the landowner, the government, the local community around that building to kind of swipe through, like Tinder, their choices for what can go in that spot. And then they take that and they go to the next level of fidelity and the next level of fidelity. So basically, within the scope of maybe a few weeks or a couple of months, without having to hire architects, engineers, civil planners, consultants, just in this virtual sandbox, the SimCity sandbox, they can get, the approval for that kind of building in that kind of space. That's huge. That is a sea change again, and a renaissance for planning conditions. And Autodesk has a platform as well, for this. The Esri also has a platform for this. It's a big, huge, multi-decade, fantastic company, Esri, in terms of place and data. And so, in other words, that there's already an industrial, and I mean behemoth, investment in this kind of leapfrog software for changing planning conditions. The other side of it that's in favor of RO Village OS is that now there are very, very strict guidelines coming from the EU, let's say, because we're a Dutch holding company, right? The EU has recently, within the last few weeks, has changed the rules for fund managers. Big funds can no longer call their fund green or eco or sustainable or ESG, SDG, whatever, if they don't actually check off all of those boxes, right? And there's not a lot of business plans like ours in the world that have almost all of the 17 SDGs under one umbrella, that we can design that way, build that way, track that way, and continuously deliver those metrics to those stakeholders, right? So all of that are these forces. Joined in that, so the big funds are pinched right now to do these things. The software side is proving these things out, okay? Then the other side really, has to do with, the demand side, that there's a huge demand from families who want to live like this. They want to live in these kinds of communities. They want to use their capital to invest for themselves, for their kids, their grandkids, et cetera, in these kinds of communities. And then the fourth, peg in this stool is the prefab constructors. The prefab constructors, we're talking about assembly line industrial players who are creating volumetric or component homes using passive circular building materials, right? The 3D printing extrusion market, which is now coming to life. It's maturing. It's still nascent, but it's coming. in other words, you have to look at all the indicators. You don't have to be much of a futurist to see where all of this is really going to go. So within the next few years, governments are going to be provided a new digital set of rules that they can very easily check off and allow for the fast-track development in the right way of these kinds of neighborhoods in balance with open space. So it's not just paving over farmland. And that's our sweet spot with our Village OS, because we concern ourselves with the non-built area. That's not something developers are interested in for the most part, unless you're talking about a golf course, right, or a ski area. And we replace the golf course and the ski area with the amenities of critical life support systems.
Sounds really fantastic. But so my question is, Village OS sort of binds all the technology together and makes it sort of like in a nice package for everyone to use. But since you talk about 3D printing, prefab homes, so all the and you also talk about a housing crisis currently with more than 1 billion homes that are needed to sustain a living. So all the technology and the Village OS itself makes like eco-villages or REGEN eco-villages very, very expensive. However, you say that these kind of communities, these eco-villages will render, using your quote here, no longer housing no longer as a privilege but as a right. So can you explain how REGEN villages, something sounding very high tech and very expensive, how does that solve the problem for housing for people with low income in different countries?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm inspired in many ways by at Stanford by what's called the D School, the design school, and they have as part of the D School this group called Design for Extreme Affordability, where they are given a task. They're given some expensive thing in the world that is quite urgent and necessary. And their task is to break it down to its most critical human need of what this thing is supposed to actually do for humans, for people or planet, and then come up with a solution that is fractional to the cost of the let's say the full-blown version of that. It's doing same or similar things. So I'm inspired by that, okay? So, and also by Elon Musk. I'm a total fanboy of this idea of you start with the Roadster, you go to the Model S, you've got the Y, the Model 3, all the different kind of interpretations where eventually you could see this coming down in cost to sort of the Tata version, you know what I mean? Like this, very inexpensive electric vehicle. And so our goal with REGEN Villages is very much to be a global South oriented expression of these modern eco-village interpretations, where, especially with 3D extrusion of earthen building materials, especially like hempcrete and bamboo-crete and other kinds of earthen building materials can be extruded through these systems, and within a matter of a few weeks, you can literally print a 300-400 home neighborhood, and that's based on preliminarily doing the regenerative permaculture infrastructure, so that when the monsoon does come, the land that has been denuded for so many eons all of a sudden comes back to life. And we've seen this time and time again around the planet, that it doesn't actually take long at all to be restorative in your practices, okay? So it's actually pretty low tech, as a matter of fact. And so what we can do is we can take what we're doing in Norway and Netherlands and UK and US, Canada, etc., and we can start to really apply this model, the Village OS, to design for extreme affordability. So then you have, the regenerative systems that are in symbiosis with the built environment, and most importantly, that these communities have what they need to get by and survive and thrive. And then, as what's beautiful about these designs, by the way, is that as time goes by, they get better. It's like fine wine. They improve, they blossom, they fruit. When they blossom and fruit and you have food forests, what happens is you get these wildlife corridors. You get these transiting birds and animals who bring heirloom and pioneer growth. So in other words, things that weren't planted there came from the scat of another animal, and that's nature. And all of a sudden that starts to take root and grow and be indigenous to this area. And it's life affirming. Hey, you walk out and every day you just see your community is just getting kind of bushier and more blossomy and more fruity and delicious and just bursting with flavors, right? And that makes people feel safe and healthy. And at the same time, when you feel safe and healthy because you're surrounded by abundant surplus, it triggers generosity. It triggers compassion and altruism and all these things, which then release dopamine, oxytocin, and all of these lovely chemicals in our brains that just make us want to do better and do more of these kinds of things for people and planet. So in any case, that's our driving goal is to bring this to the global South in a way that governments, especially around the world, understand that this is actually a very small investment to make in these kinds of new build communities, because in the long run, they reduce burdens on government. They reduce burdens on the draw to these people going to the cities. They reduce the burdens on healthcare systems. They broker peaceful, happy places. These are all what we call these long-term positive externalities. And we just finished a research initiative with Duke University that shows what it will look like to live in a regen village 50 years later, in terms of not only how great and happy everybody living in the neighborhood is, but the positive goodwill radius, which is typically about 25 kilometers goodwill radius around a single eco-village community. That's a big goodwill radius, if you think about it. So if you start building these lily pads, right, of interconnected, self-sustaining, thriving, flourishing, blossoming places, the ripple effect of positive goodwill reduces burdens across the board. This is urgent. This is like, this is not a pitch. This is an absolute urgent call to action that we do this. And that's the reason why behind the Village OS, that's the reason behind REGEN Villages. It's the whole concept of fast track planning and prefab and 3D construction. We need to do it faster. We have to be able to go from concept to move in within 2 years for these kinds of communities. And then we can really start to affect positive change around the world.
Okay, so you're talking about speed here with environment. So you were planning to build 77,000 homes in 22 countries by 2024.
That was ambitious.
So how is progress so far, and do you think it's enough at this rate?
Well, it's one of those wonderful proclamations, I'm sure, that's hit many entrepreneurs in the head like a brick many times in their lives. It was a really ambitious, optimistic thought, back in 2016, with the kind of momentum we were feeling from the industrial players and from some of the funds we had been talking to. And honestly, the status quo is so strong. It's so strong in the construction industry, the material industry, in the planning. Those are the folks, by the way, who set the planning rules, right? And the conditions. So there's a nice little tight cabal there that doesn't want innovation. They want it on their own terms, right? So basically, we are doing our very best right now to get the first pilot communities off the ground, and we feel that once we prove out even the first pilot community, that we get it built and we get it done, and we're able to do this on existing farmland. So changing the rules and zoning, also to get it built within 3 years, and then be able to start to apply those metrics of positive goodwill, that this will be essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. And like I mentioned earlier to you about that four-prong stool, that the three of those prongs are really industrial players. They're landowners, they're government, they're funds, they're these constructors doing prefab work. So there's going to be more and more an awakening to this, and so will it be enough? Quite honestly, we need to start, right? So there's only one way to fix things, and that's to grab a tool belt and head out and start doing it, right? For sure, our thesis has come true, okay? Because 7-8 years ago, we predicted that something would happen to make cities feel less safe, and that people would want to start to move from cities back to the countryside. I was told by many people politely that I was misguided, that the trend to cities was so strong that it could never be broken. And yet all the climate data is indicating that these coastal megacities are in the direct bullseye of collapse, and that there's not much we're going to do to retrofit and work our way out of these global coastal megacities. So again, a trend is a shiny object dangling in the distance. And now what we're seeing is, because of this exodus from cities and this PTSD because of COVID, right, that people want more than ever to live in an agrihood. We've seen that the globalized distribution matrices can be very easily disrupted, whether it's hoarding or whether it's a container ship being stuck in the Suez Canal. All of a sudden, the shelves go bare. And you don't need many experience of that when you go to the supermarket and you see that things aren't there that you want or need, to start to realize that you better start doing these things yourself. But people coming from cities have no skills for this. So that's why we need to create these turnkey communities that enable them to be an urbanite, but live in the countryside, enjoy these amenities, be the digital nomads that they want to be, to a certain extent, or digital workers, etc. Create new economic models from living in these places, and we have to make a start. That's what I'm saying. Okay.
Personally, for me, I would definitely love to live in a REGEN Eco-Village when I grow up. But yeah, it sounds super interesting. But I think there might be skeptics who might be thinking that this is too good to be true. So are there any drawbacks, or are there really any drawbacks to REGEN villages?
Well, look, I like to say often that there's no such thing as utopia. There isn't, okay? Human nature, by default, has these bell curves. We go through these moments where we feel amazing, generous, and gratitude, happy, all that. And then we go down sine wave, and we feel depressed, downtrodden, aggressive, angry. All of those things happen in the context of a single hour for some people, or a day, or a week, whatever. So in other words, happiness is elusive. Flourishing is actually a little bit less elusive, because we know to a certain extent that there are circumstances you can create that makes for flourishing. So, what we have to do is look at the best in people, and the best in systems, and the best in capabilities, and strive, isn't it? We have to strive every day. Okay? All we're trying to do is say, look, you can go back to the countryside and don't have to be a farmer, right? That there's a managed service infrastructure for that. You pay an association fee, and those amenities are covered. If you want to contribute and work in the community gardens in the village and etc., then we will ledger that, and we'll reduce your monthly association fee based on whatever tasks that you or your family contribute, right? So it's really an eco-village on your own terms in that regard. We're trying to solve for where these intentional communities typically fall in on themselves, which is one person, one vote, or one family, one vote, where they try to create these democracies that don't really work, because there's always going to be these psychological personality types that want to foment chaos or discord, right? And whereas the average subdivision community, that doesn't happen, because people move in, they buy a house, they rent a house, they have a management company, that they have a kind of a 10 commandments, things that they sign that they're willing to abide by, whatever it is. So the answer to your question is that it's chaos theory, man. It's chaos theory. We don't really know how exactly people are going to interact with each other. You may be next door neighbor to somebody that you hate, but become best of friends with somebody who lives across, the garden from you. And we can't control for that. We cannot socially engineer to such a place. And even if we did, there's no saying that you're at some point going to switch, alliances, allegiance with friends in a community. So the point, though, is that we can do our best to answer for your basic human needs and try to address the best we possibly can social affordability and inclusion into these communities, so that we are really looking at solving for these much broader issues and problems. And that ought to give people a sense of tranquility. And that's a lovely thing to strive for. Okay? What we call homeostasis. That place where you are when you've eaten a delicious meal, you've had a fantastic dessert, maybe you've had a glass of wine or beer or whatever it is, and you're with good friends, and you don't need anything else in that moment. You're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're not tired. You have, you're just in balance, and that's not easy to get to, but we strive for that.
Perfect. So sounds really fantastic. And sorry, just two final quick questions. So there's your REGEN Ecovillages as a solution to our current living situations. However, there are also various other environmental solutions, such as vertical farming in cities, as well as some scientists or some people even propose to continue to use nuclear power as a solution to combustible energy. So how do you think REGEN Villages compare to those other solutions? And do you think there are some benefits to those other solutions as well?
Well, in terms of vertical farming, we of course are intending to take the best in class aquaponic, aeroponic, controlled environment systems into our REGEN Villages communities, because this gives you this year-round nutritional supplement. Our intent is to add these modules to those systems that would be, again, striving for symbiosis, that you've got your chicken coops, you've got your light dairy, the sheep and goat and the occasional cow wandering around. The barns are also connected there, because then you get a certain amount of BTUs from those animals for the greenhouse heat. To combine that with vermiculture, to digest waste, food and animal waste, but then that turns into food for the chickens and the fish and the other small animals. So you get full circularity there. And then there's other, pieces and components, whether it's mushrooms or other artisanal ingredients, so that one building or a structure of building with these adjoining modules is able to produce tons of food year round and delicious, bioavailable, fresh food. So we're totally, bullish on that. I'm not so bullish necessarily on just leafy greens and microgreens coming from those vertical systems. And in urban areas, in particular, that we have to be cognizant that these sort of clean room hydroponic systems, I don't feel like are the best way forward. I haven't seen it yet that it makes me convinced that's the best way forward. And especially what it's producing is not really capable of sustaining a diverse menu that we've seen. It's a piece of a puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle. So I'm more interested in the work that the folks have done in Brooklyn, in New York, on taking over rooftop across the city and laying soil down and doing, beautiful, diverse, organic farming and gardens on those rooftops. And there's right there is a, an opportunity to create these biodiverse things. So that's on that side. On nuclear power, Einstein said famously, paraphrasing, it's a hell of a way to make steam. Meaning, it's not necessarily, when you look at what it does, of course it's great, in fact that you're getting what seems to be quote unquote free energy from, the generation of the steam into those turbines. But there is a lot of negative externalities associated with those systems, and a tremendous amount of cost in building, these systems. I think at some point, that, you can go from fission to fusion, and, if you're able to take, especially the nuclear waste that exists already on Earth and convert that into something, I think that's really interesting. I've seen some of these ideas about taking small amounts of this nuclear waste from these existing plants and enclosing it in kind of like a diamond battery that can last for 1,000 years. And I think that's super interesting. I think those are the kinds of plays that need to happen in terms of on the storage side for recycling in a circular way, that those things. Otherwise, I'm just really bullish on whatever's coming in terms of energy storage, because this is going to be a huge tipping point, right? When you have solar arrays and wind and other kinds of diverse power generation, and all of a sudden you can store it and release it in an incredibly cost-effective, lossless manner, and store it for long periods of time, especially in a very cheap way, in a clean way, right? That is going to overnight, and I mean overnight, change the game when it comes to these small community microgrids. Literally, maybe they're not cutting the cord to the district scale utilities, but they're becoming themselves power plants. I really get excited about the idea of neighborhoods contributing to the grids and reducing burdens on the grids, rather than, looking at them drawing power. So those are my takes on those things. I want to have design empathy. I want to be open-minded and look at lots of different things. So we're always, that's also the beauty of REGEN Villages, is the fact that we're not pigeonholed into one specific siloed or multiple silo technology platforms. Whether it's from a microgrid perspective, there's Schneider Electric, there's Siemens, there's Bosch, LG, Panasonic. I mean, there's some big players out there, either in this field or hopping into this field. So it's just a matter of, us looking for the best in class, and that, can communicate with our Village OS, and then, from there we can take it further. Okay. But yeah.
Yeah, I definitely see that. So just take the best of everything.
Yeah, take the best of everything, and again, my background is not reinventing the wheel. My background has always been, coming from a video game design background, for instance. A new console comes out. I don't care who it's from, Sony or Nintendo or Sega or Atari, whoever it is. I would be excited about it, but I wouldn't do anything for it. I wouldn't design for it. I would wait to see the market uptake. I would wait to see, what the SDKs look like. I'd wait to see, what the rules and regulations were and are for those games. How much freedom we would have, what our royalty would be. In other words, you wait till it matures, and then you say, okay, now it looks like the right time to bring in some interesting concepts and innovate.
Okay, I see. And one final question is, what messages or advice would you like to leave with our listeners?
Well, the assumption is listeners are mostly students, faculty, others. The message really is that one person or small group of people can make a huge positive impact for the planet and for humanity. And that even though what it seems like is and are daunting circumstances in terms of climate, in terms of now health because of COVID, in terms of brittle infrastructure and collapse, in terms of money, lack of thereto, et cetera, that, just believe in yourself, that you can actually come up with an idea and focus on it and make a huge difference. And I relate this to this idea that I've seen more and more over the last few years, especially of the sort of individuals who, like for instance, in southern India, there's stories of this sort of these people, like one guy, for instance, who went out and for 29 years, he went to this completely barren, desertified landscape because it was denuded of all of its trees and timber and just went into collapse. And methodically, one person in 29 years, every day, went out to plant trees. And 29 years later, there's something like, a 500 hectare area that is completely reforested. It's brought rain, the elephants came back, the tigers came back, the birds came back. It provided then water back to the aquifer for the village that he lives in. And so it started to restore and bring resources back to these places. We've seen also in southern India, these communities coming together to carve out these berms and these swells for capturing monsoon and doing it in the right way, where the hillsides are. And after one monsoon, after one rainy season, the aquifers were restored, sufficient enough to grow rice, sufficient enough to graze, and all of a sudden, those same people typically who had to leave the village during the dry season to go find work in the cities didn't have to leave, which meant that their kids could stay in school. These stories bring tears to my eyes because it's not a matter of tech. It's a matter of taking one step or even a half a step towards Mother Earth, and she will literally throw her arms around us. And that is what I want to impart to the folks listening. Also, of course, if people happen to be connected to family offices and family wealth, and know of people who might be interested in investing in REGEN Villages, we're always looking for good, qualified impact investors because we're definitely on a mission and we're going to get this done. So thanks for that.
No, thank you for coming onto the show. And again, thank you so much. And it was a very, very interesting episode, and personally very excited for what your project has in store for us. And I want to finish off with that. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks again.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was so super interesting.
Yeah, that's great. All right. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone who tuned in to listen. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we did during the interview.
If you liked this episode, learned something, or just want to help out a bunch of students, please leave a review, write a comment, and share this on social media. If you are listening to this on YouTube, please subscribe and write to us in the comments.
All the books and other resources recommended by the interviewee are in the podcast description/video description depending on your platform, and depending on when you see this, you might be able to use our affiliate link to purchase them.
The Marianopolis Addendum podcast is actively seeking local sponsors here in Montreal, so if you are interested, please contact us at the email linked in the description. All the profit generated by this podcast will go back to fund our club's activity. If we have any surplus, they will be donated at the end of every month to a local charity.
This episode was edited by Lucy Ann.
And the artwork is done by Camilla Huang.
The producers and guests associated with this episode may express their opinion, But this podcast does not support any political parties. We only aim to bring different perspectives on different issues through the free exchange of opinions and ideas.
We look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast.